Thank you, Dave, for reading that for us. A blessed good morning to all of you. Just a couple of thoughts here before we get into our lesson. Let's remember Isley. She's really struggling with the issue with her feet, her legs, and so let's keep them in our prayers. And especially Tuesday, let's think of Nancy Bynum. Not only going through cancer surgery, but how difficult it must be to do it without Bill being here and without a home of her own. And thank you, Mikey and Beth, for agreeing to kind of care for her and take care of her. And let's all be praying for good results there. So this morning, remember, after Bible class, we're going to do a actual, not extreme makeover, but a little makeover, because this is the week that we're going to be putting in the new projector and the new screen and the new monitors. And so hopefully next Sunday, all that will be put up. And to that degree, many of you volunteered, but if you didn't get the message and you want to help, we do need some help after Bible class, moving the Lord's Supper table, moving this furniture over to the side, and also bringing the scaffolding in for him to use that. So that's going on after Bible class this morning. And in advance, thank you so much for your help. Well, that ties into what we want to get to this morning in our lesson, and that is we're going to get back to the series that originally was called Living for Christ, Now That I'm a Christian. This idea of what is expected of me now that I'm a Christian. What is this commitment that I have made to Jesus Christ? And we're using this extreme makeover like the TV show, but we're not doing the home edition, we're doing the spirit edition. And so we're going to get right into that because that's exactly what Jesus does to us. He's taken us and he's doing this extreme makeover to make us into his image. All right, so let's get back into this, and I want you to look at this house, and you don't have to say anything, but I just want to put in your mind how much. Let's say you didn't have any limit of money, you could afford it. How much would you spend on this house? Now, this is a house that is in Southern California, 2-story house, 4-bedroom, 3 baths, about 2,400 square feet. South Orange County in a very nice area called Ladera Ranch. All right, so you've got that figure in your mind, how much you would be willing to pay for this, because obviously you don't want to overpay, right? All right, so with that in mind, just by a raise of hands, how many would be willing to pay $800,000 for this house? Nobody. Okay. I would pay $800,000 for this house. $1 million for this house. I would pay $1.2 million for this house. But of course, I can say that because I know that recently it just sold for $1.65 million. So if you would have bought it for $800,000, you would have doubled your money like that. Of course, minus any money you had to put into it to flip it, to make this extreme makeover, right? But you can see that why there's so many people that do this, especially in California, because the market just goes up and up and up, right? They take a house that is broken. They take a house that has been just kind of ignored and left alone, and it's just kind of worn out. And they get that for a cheap price, given the market value. And then they put a little bit of money into it, they give it love and care, and they make it over, and then they sell it for a big profit. Now that's what Jesus does to us. Romans chapter 5, he comes to us when we're broken, when we've been undervalued, when we've been ignored. We are godless, we were sinners, we were enemies, and he says, I'm going to make you over. I'm going to do this extreme makeover, and you're going to be valuable. The only thing is he doesn't sell us. He presents us as his bride, holy, pure, and blameless. And so we talked about in our last two lessons, now that I'm a Christian, what is he trying to make over? What do I need to change? And we talked about that, now that I'm a Christian, I have the responsibility to my neighbor. And that means I have a responsibility to a church, to work and to worship and to do my part to build that church up. But I also have a responsibility to those outside that are non-Christians as well. And I can't just use excuses and say, well, that's not the way I was raised. I can't just say, well, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. This is the commitment we made when we were baptized into Christ. Just like we talked about last week. That baptism is more than, it's not just about being immersed in the water. It's going from one life to a new life. The old life to this newness of life, all through God's salvation, through the grace of God and through his blood. We also talked about how, now that I'm a Christian, I have to be a law-abiding citizen. As long as that law doesn't make me and force me or try to force me to disobey God, who is the ultimate one that I worship and serve, and his law. Now, that doesn't mean I have to be a law-agreeing citizen. That doesn't mean I have to love the person in power, the leaders, right? I don't have to agree, but I have to be a law-abiding. I have to love and pray for them. I have to respect them. And number 3, he talked about we have to have a godly tongue. I now speak with God with reverence and honor and glory. I don't use his name in vain. We use our words to build people up. We don't use unwholesome words. And you can start to see in this that in different areas, depending on who you are, depending on how you are as you come to Jesus Christ, some are going to be more extreme than others. Some are going to be more difficult than others. A truck driver that comes here, he might have a lot of difficulty with number 3 because, well, that's the language that they use. But someone else might have more trouble with number 2 or number 1. But we're going to add a 4th one, and that is, now that I'm a Christian, Christ expects me to be morally pure. We're going to talk about how contrary our culture is when it comes to this aspect. To be and live a morally pure life. And as we read in Hebrews 13, verse 4 and 5, we're talking about that relationship that God has created where the marriage is to be held and honored by all, and the marriage bed be undefiled. Now, I recognize when we talk about Hebrews 13 and verse 4, and the things that are listed there, number 1, I understand that our culture has done a 180 to what God has commanded and created. And understand that that's very difficult, that this is something that really can affect a lot of people. And I want to tell you, it's a very important subject, but it is a difficult subject. It's one that requires a true love of God, but it also requires sensitivity and understanding and a true desire. And I realize it's a difficult subject to talk about, especially in a sermon setting, in a public setting, and I'm going to do my best to be sensitive to that. I think you understand what I'm talking about. Even Paul had to talk in a certain way to not be hidden of what he's talking about. But in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 3 through 5, Paul had to address this immorality that was common in the Gentile world in so many of his letters, like Thessalonica. And so in 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 3 through 5, for this is the will of God, he says. Notice how he starts that. For this is the will of God, your sanctification. We know sanctification is the idea of being set apart. It is the word very closely related to the word hagios, holy. Being holy, a holy one. To be a saint is the one who's sanctified. But what is he meaning when he says your sanctification? Well, look at what he says. That is that you abstain from sexual immorality. That each of you know how to possess his own vessel in sanctification and honor, and not in lustful compassion. I think we all can understand what he's talking about there. As a Christian, we can't live like our culture. We can't live like the world and says, oh, it's okay to disobey what God created. Now, before we move on, I also want to say this, that as I talk to my students about this, and I think this is important, that I realize that sometimes this really addresses the way that they had been living or the way that they are living. And I realize how difficult that can be to be feeling guilty that you violated Christ and his law for so long. And I want to make this statement, that all this still can be cleansed. This still can be repented of. This still can be changed and forgiven. And you can live in purity and morality in that new life. But you can't continue to live like the old self. It's like our theme this year. We're forgetting what lies behind. And part of that, just like it was for Paul, is to get beyond the guilt of disobeying God for so long and what? Pressing forward in righteousness. Getting past that guilt. I don't want this lesson to be one that just riddles you with the guilt of the way you used to live. But I've also had conversations and studies with students where they are all, they're really coming to Christ. They're really about, okay, I'm all into Christ. And we talk about this, and this just hits them like a ton of bricks. And they're not willing to change. And they'll make statements like, I'm not willing to change that relationship with my girlfriend, my boyfriend. I'm not willing to ask them to move out because we're living together. And usually they'll give me a whole list of physical things of why that works for them. But it's like we've been talking about. Can't just look at the outside of the house. You can't just look at Christianity as a list of assets and losses from a physical standpoint. You'll never see the greatness of what Jesus can do for you in his kingdom by doing that. And so where I want to take you now is I want to go back to the beginning. And when we're talking to our students and even when I'm talking to my children, when you talk to your children, I want to start from the very beginning, and I want them to understand. From the very beginning, God created us with this desire, this physical desire and urge. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing impure about that. In fact, like everything else that God created, it is very good, it is beautiful, it is pleasurable, it is clean, and it is moral. And I want my kids and I want my students to understand that's the way it was in the beginning. But it can be difficult to talk about those things. Why? Because the way the world has perverted and made ugly what God has made so beautiful. The world slowly has turned its back on God's ideal of how to enjoy this. They have taken it out of the bedroom and put it in books and magazines and in TV shows and in movies. And in fact, when's the last time you saw a character in a TV show or movie that was a virgin waiting until it was right, until they got married? It's very rare to see that. In fact, in most cases, when you see a couple portrayed, two single people, it's just assumed and often shown that they're involved in that type of relationship. But from the beginning, it wasn't perverted like that. And it's nothing to be ashamed of. I want to use an illustration to make a point related to this. And I've gone kind of back and forth as to use this or not. But I remember, not the beginning. I don't remember when Disneyland started. I wasn't born yet. I'm not that old. But I do remember my parents taking me to Disneyland as a young child. And I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But I want you to think about Walt Disney here. He had this dream, and he had this childlike imagination, even as an adult. He had this dream to make this land of Disney that adults and children and families could come and enjoy it. He wanted this land where it could be something that was pleasurable and enjoyable. And so he put this dream into effect. And beginning in July 1954, they started building this Disneyland. And not that it was completely finished, but enough to where they could open and function. In July of 1955, it opened up. And yet, as he created this land to be pleasurable and to have enjoyment, never did he have the mind that anyone could come in there and just enjoy it any way they want. He made rules and regulations so that it would be enjoyed by all and in the right way. And we look at that and we say, we understand that. It's one of those things in the world. We understand it. Well, you create it. You can figure out how it's to be used, right? You got these people and these companies that make these products, and you buy that product because it's going to make your life more enjoyable, or you're going to make your life easier. And, what did it come with? Well, it comes with this manual of instructions, how to use this properly. And as long as you're not a man, you're going to read that. Men, we don't read the instructions and then we pay the price. But how do you use this? How to use it properly? It's one of those things in the world. We understand that in the world, but then when you get to the Bible, it says it doesn't fit there. It doesn't work there. What I want us to understand is that God created this desire within us, as part of us, but he also created the rules and the regulations of how to enjoy that. You can't just enjoy it any way that you want. I remember as a boy, when you went to Disneyland, your parents had to buy a book of tickets. And there were different letters to these tickets. There was an A ride and a B ticket, and all the way to, I think it was E, if I remember correctly. And the E tickets were the fast rides. They were the good rides, right? But you only got so many in that ticket book. And once you were done with all the E ticket rides, all you had was the A, the simple rides, the slow rides. Well, it didn't matter. If you wanted to continue to ride the E-ticket rides, you didn't have a ticket. You couldn't just get on there. That was the rule. This is the way it worked. It was kind of their way of keeping crowd control, lines shortened. I also remember as a kid when they introduced the Ride Everything Pass. And you could just buy that ticket. You actually had to have a ticket. And, okay, I can ride this. Here's my ticket. And then I remember my teen years where you just pay the entrance and you go ride everything. But in the beginning, you only had so many e-ticket rides. And once those were gone, that's the way it worked. Well, in God's way, God from the very beginning has a plan how this works to keep it clean and pure, enjoyable. In Genesis chapter 2, we see Adam there, and God looks and he says, the first time, this is not good. It's not good for man to be alone. And not that man was alone only and solely in this way, but he was alone in this way of fulfilling this desire. And so God created a helpmate, a companion, a woman for him. And without getting too graphic, I think we can see in that Adam was not left alone to fulfill this desire. This idea of self-gratification is not spoken of directly in God's word, but we can clearly see that was not God's plan. And how to fulfill this. He this woman for him. And we go throughout the Bible and we see that's exactly God's desire. In fact, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 2, as they're asking about a present distress, a difficult time, they've actually asked him a question. And Paul writes by inspiration, but because of immoralities, each man is to have his own wife and each woman is to have her own husband. God has placed that in its proper setting. And there's a reason why that's the proper setting. We're going to end on that when we get to the end. But that is it within marriage, where a husband and wife have left and cleaved to one another and created this covenant of marriage. They are committed to one another. In fact, he goes on in this to talk about that they have a duty to one another. And that the husband doesn't have all rights and privileges, but the wife does, and vice versa. It goes back to what God created in the very beginning. And so, in our passage today, Hebrews 13, verse 4, the Hebrew author, towards the end of the book, it gets more of a letter that we're used to, more of this exhortations. But he doesn't pull any punches. He says it very clearly. Marriage is to be held in honor of but how God sees it as being held in honor. The way God created it. And that the marriage bed be undefiled for fornicators and adulterers, God will judge. There's two words I want to talk about here. Number one is this word he uses, fornicators. It's coming from the Greek word porneia. And porneia is an interesting word because it's used in two senses, kind of like the word servant in the Bible. Sometimes the word servant is used of, all servants of Jesus Christ. Sometimes it's used of a deacon, more of a specific sense. And in this case, porneia is that way. Sometimes it's used as the general term of immorality, all the different types of immorality. And if we want to just talk about them under one umbrella, you're just going to use this word porneia. But sometimes it's also used of a more specific type of immorality of two single people fulfilling this desire in a relationship other than marriage. Something that is just so commonplace today. And so it's the context will tell you if it's used more in the general sense or more in the specific. You can see in our passage it's used in the more specific sense here in Hebrews 13 because he designates it separate from this other word, adulterers, which is the Greek word moikos, specifically referring to immorality of a married person fulfilling that desire outside of marriage with someone they're not married to. And so, these are the things that the world says it's okay, as long as we have two consenting adults. But what we want to take a look at is what happens when we take this relationship outside of marriage. What happens? Well, there's all sorts of unfruitful consequences, things that not only affect the two people that have decided to be involved in such a relationship, but those around them. And so let's talk a little bit about outside of the marriage. Number one, we see a culture that speaks a lot like Satan. That's bought in this idea that teens are going to do it, you can't stop them. And so what's been the result? Schools getting involved, promoting safety instead of abstinence. The truth is, you can't stop them if you teach them properly, if you teach them from God's Word. You can. And you need to. because they're too young to handle that type of responsibility, that type of relationship. God has placed it in marriage for a reason. There's commitment, there's maturity, there's completeness, there's stability there. Teenagers, they haven't met those requirements. And we want to teach our kids, the answer is not no, 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 don't. Again, looking back to the beginning, it's clean, it's moral, it's godly, it's created by God. What we want to tell them is wait. Wait till it's right. Wait till it's godly. Wait till you can do it as God had created. We've got so many situations of single mothers raising kids without a father, sometimes a father raising without a mother. Not ideal. Again, Christians can live in a situation and get past those types of things, but it's going to be more difficult on them. A lot of times these single mothers are, just like we talked about in the top teens. And there's been all sorts of consequences with that. A lot of times young grandparents raising their grandchildren as their own children. It's not the way God designed it. You're not supposed to have to do that all over. You've already done it. Now you're supposed to enjoy your grandchildren as grandparents. But sometimes, and bless them for this, grandparents have to step in because they are what? They're mature and complete and dedicated to one another. They have that stability. But if you're going to have children, you have to be mature enough to what? Raise them up. To teach them. To guide them. But this is a consequence of taking this outside of marriage. We're also told that in our society, being a virgin is wrong. It's silly. It's ridiculous. People are made fun because of that. Young Christians are being made fun of, ridiculed because of that. But not just young Christians, adults as well. I want to share this story with you. It happened back in 2014. This is Katie Couric in her morning show. And they decided to do this show on the virginity movement. Adults that are committed to wait until marriage. And this lady that she's interviewing here has the boldness, has the confidence to go onto the show and to talk about why she's waiting. She's 36 years of age at this point. And she explains that she is waiting to do it right. She's waiting for Mr. Right. And when the show's over and the cameras are off and the lights are turned off, Katie Couric gives her some advice. And that is, her advice is, you need to stop living in this fantasy world. There is no right person. There is no Mr. Right. You just need to go out and you can fill in the blank. In an interview later on, this young lady said that felt like a slap in the face. She has the kindness to go on this show and to help them with this. And what do? They ridicule her. And if you remember, Katie Couric got in a lot of trouble herself, and many in that show, because of immorality. Finally, at age 41, this young lady found Mr. Right and got married and was happy that she did wait till it was right. Outside of marriage, what happens? Well, disease, unwanted pregnancy, murder, death. Tim and I like to watch these murder shows. It shows you how strange we are. It's not dramas, that they're actually shows about murders that have happened and who did it, and it all plays out at the end. And many of them are this very thing where we have this relationship outside of marriage. She gets pregnant. He doesn't want a child, and he kills both the mother and the child. It's just gross. And then a different kind of murder, and that is abortion. Direct related to this very way the world looks at what is right. Now, you put this list up here and you do it God's way. You put it in its proper setting, and these consequences, for the most part, go away. They're gone. They're not experienced. And a big part of what we see, that the crumbling of a family in our society today, is related to exactly what we're talking about today. Broken homes. Well, how does it start broken? It starts with starting life from the middle, not from the beginning. When you start life from the middle, then what? Sin is acceptable. What God created from the beginning has changed. Think about a child being born in the world today versus back when you and I were born. What they're going to be taught from a society, from a cultural standpoint, especially if they don't have Christian parents to teach them and guide them and lead them, they're going to look at the world a lot different as far as right and wrong than the way we were raised. And so, as a Christian, now that I'm a Christian, He's molding me. He's making me over to live in righteousness, including putting that desire in its right and proper place. Maybe there's one here this morning that isn't a Christian. Maybe you've been thinking about it. I hope you don't look at it simply from that standpoint of what you have to give up physically, but look at it that one day, being betrothed to Christ, He's going to come back for His bride. And you're going to enjoy that marriage, and you're going to enjoy that marriage feast with Jesus Christ for eternity in heaven. If we can help you come to Christ and become a Christian, if we can help you with sin, either this sort or any other sort, if we could pray with you, study with you, let it be known as together we stand and as we sing.